Welcome to Oracle Class 305. This is June the 10th, 2024, and I'm Ray Smith, historian for the city of Oak Ridge. And as others come on, I'll be letting them on, and notice that I have muted you as you've come on, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to me. If you want to say anything, just unmute yourself and make any comments or ask any questions. We have 3 sessions that are going to be happening, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into where we're going with this. We have, let's see if I can get the right one back up. Well, that's not it. That's it. Okay. Now, what I want to show you is that we're going to have guests each Monday. Bill Lepp is our guest that I have on this morning. He's a storyteller, and we're going to talk about one of his stories that he actually has just presented in Oak Ridge just this last weekend. And then next Monday, we'll have Dennis Aislinger, who has written a book about the John Hendrix, or the Prophet of Oak Ridge. He's a great grandson of John Hendrix. And then the last Monday, we'll have Cameron Reed, and he's written a book called the Manhattan Project Encyclopedia. So I think you'll find those things of interest, and we will be bringing those guests on as we go along. So first of all, any questions or comments, or I always look for ideas for what you would like me to include in stories from the Secret City. So don't hesitate at any time to make suggestions to me. You can put it in the chat, or you can make comments, and we'll talk about what you want to see next time, and I'll try to work it in. Or I might be able to work it in today. It depends on what you ask. So hearing nothing else, we're going to go ahead and start with Bill Lepp. I am just so glad that he's agreed to be here with us this morning. And we're going to just spend some time in conversation and letting you all benefit from that conversation, and ask any questions of me or of Bill anytime you want to as we're going along. The story that he researched and has told twice now in Oak Ridge is the story of John Hendrix. And I want him to talk a bit about how he got interested in that and how he went about researching it, and just give you some insight into how a storyteller puts together stories that, and I'll have to tell you, I don't know how many times, but Bill has won liars contests. Okay, so you have to realize that not everything he says is exactly true, but I'll tell you that what he did in the research for John Hendrix, he has brought the research as accurately as anyone I've ever seen to do that research. So, Bill, I have not done a good job of introducing you. So let me ask you to tell them just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into talking about the John Hendrix story. So take it away and tell them a little about yourself first.
Okay, I can't figure out if I turn my mute off. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you. Hear you fine.
Okay, good. My name is Bill Lepp. I'm from South Charleston, West Virginia. I've been a full-time professional storyteller for the last 21 years. I travel all around the country, going to a lot of storytelling festivals, schools, colleges, social events, whatever. Basically, if you have some money and you need a speaker, I'm your guy. but I did get my start in the West Virginia Liars Contest, which is a tall tale contest that we have every year here in Charleston. And I didn't even know at the time that you could be a professional storyteller. I was 20 years old. I entered the contest. The grand prize was $100. I won second place, which was $75. And then I just kept at that, and I won the Liars Contest 5 times through about from 1990 to 1998. And then in 2000, I got invited to the National Storytelling Festival over in Jonesboro, Tennessee, to do a 15-minute spot. And after that, things just took off. And about 7-8 years ago, I got invited to the first Flatwater Storytelling Festival in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that was being started by some folks. And I've been coming out there ever since. 3 years ago, a storyteller, Sheila Arnold, she told the story that Storytelling Festival asked her to write a special story, and she told the story of the desegregation of the schools. I think it was in Clinton, or was it Oak Ridge?
Oh, it's Oak Ridge.
Okay, so she talked about the desegregation of the schools, and then somebody asked me if I would do a story about John Hendrix. Sorry.
It's early in the morning, Bill, I understand.
Yeah, I didn't know who he was. And so, it was interesting to dig in and find out who he was. And so most of my, all of my information came from a couple of books that have been written about him and a whole bunch of internet newspaper articles. So what's interesting about the story is I wasn't trying to prove whether or not this happened, and almost everything I've ever read about John Hendrix, there's numerous sources, but nothing pinned down exactly, except for the fact that he was born and he died. Those two things seem like everybody agrees on. And so I don't know how much you know about John Hendrix, but he was born in Oak Ridge, or near Oak Ridge. No, he's born in what is now Oak Ridge. Let's say it that way. And then he was born just after the Civil War. He, in his early years, he shot a man, killed a man, and then was acquitted at the trial because it was found to be self-defense. He got married. He had, I think, 5 children with his first wife. And then his youngest daughter died of diphtheria 2 days after John disciplined her. I've never found anything that described exactly what he did except disciplined her. So he spanked her or he shook her. Those are the speculations. And then she was 2 years old at the time. And so she died. And that was it for the wife. She'd had enough at that point. So she took the other kids and moved to Arkansas. And the guy that's coming on next week, Dennis, is one of his book is one of the books I used as a source. He just theorizes that maybe because the baby had diphtheria, that it was screaming and yelling a lot, and John shook it to get it to be quiet, to get the little girl to be quiet, and then that you're not supposed to shake a baby. And his wife did divorce him, which was difficult to do in those days. And so again, Dennis, who's coming on at your next class, speculates that maybe John was a little bit abusive. Maybe John was a lot abusive, and that's why she was able to gain to get a divorce. Anyway, he gets really depressed. At some point, he gets into the poorhouse. He's in the insane asylum part. He's probably in a cage or a cell. He escapes from that, comes out, and then says, in the next 30 days, God is going to burn this place down. And sure enough, within 30 days, lightning strikes that building and it burns to the ground. And this may or may not have been John's first prophecy, but it's certainly one that seems to be well documented and have come true. So it's one that worked out. He was either really lucky or he did in fact realize that God was going to burn this place down. So he's going through this dark night of the soul. He asked God to see the future. A voice says to him, according to him, go and sleep in the woods for 40 days with your head on the ground. And so he doesn't even take a pillow. It's so cold, his head freezes to the ground. He comes out of the woods after 40 days. And then, depending on what source you read, he delivers a series of prophecies about what's going to happen to the Oak Ridge area, including the line of the L&N railroad that he says is going to come in. He describes every station that's going to become that's going to be on the railroad. He describes the tunnel going through the Black Oak Mountain and the fact that that's going to make a spring go dry. And then he may or may not have predicted airplane flight and cargo being hauled on airplanes. But of course, his biggest predictions was that there was going to be this tremendous building built where Oak Ridge is now, that it was going to shake the ground, and that they were going to help make a weapon that was going to help the United States win the biggest war that ever was. So it seems like he predicted the coming of the Manhattan Project to the Oak Ridge area. And then he died of tuberculosis in 1915, I think. And so then things, word spread. People talked about whether or not, these predictions of John. And then I think he was sort of forgotten mostly. I mean, he was never a really well-known person in the first place. But then as these things started to happen that he had prophesied, he came back into the social conscious. And eventually there was a statue of him in front of the museum, one of the history museums down there, except some bureaucrat from Washington, D.C. came down and said there's no place for folklore at a science museum. And so they took the statue away. So that's the basic story. And when I was asked to write it, I mean, that's a lot of what I told in my story. But because I do generally just make up my stories, almost everything I write is fiction. It was tricky for me to really stick to the facts because, I was trying to make the story more interesting. And when I'm writing a story and it's not interesting, I can just make something up to make it more interesting. But of course, you can't do that with history. So I needed to organize the facts in a way that they presented themselves in an intriguing manner. And a lot of stories, I'll say a couple of things in the first sentence that I want you to know, but then I want you to forget those things. And then I'll go for 15 minutes in a totally another direction. And the story will conclude when I somehow loop back to the first thing that I said. So my stories go in all kinds of directions. But when I looked at this story, I felt like it just needed to go in a straight line because that seemed the best way to tell the story. But there had to be some hook to get the audience interested in it. So what I did was I went back and I started by talking about how I researched the history of how Oak Ridge came to be. And so I started by saying that in the 1930s, there were maybe 1,000 families, 3,000 or so people that lived in that area. And then when the government was looking for a place to do the Manhattan Project, one of the places they found was Oak Ridge. And one of the places they liked it is because there was plenty of water, there was electricity, the way the mountains were separated, you could put the different laboratories in different valleys. So if one of them exploded, they wouldn't all go off like a chain of fireworks, as someone wrote. And so the government decided we were in a hurry. The United States, nobody knew if we were going to win the war. It was pretty tight at that point. And the government decided they wanted this laboratory to be in that area. And so they sent out these letters, these notices to the people that lived there. You got to get out. And people had up to 6 weeks to vacate their property, leaving the crops in the field. And then the government often paid them less than what their property was worth. And it took a long, long time to get paid. So now you have these people being displaced. Some of these people, maybe just speculation, but because of the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Smoky Mountain National Park, some of these people may have been displaced for the third time by the government in a decade, which is a pretty amazing thing to think of. So I described how it was difficult for these people to have to just pack up with 6 weeks to go, just pack up and get out. And then I posed the question, could life have been different had someone known this was coming beforehand? What would have happened if somebody knew this was going to happen? Could the people have been better prepared? And then I start into the story of John Hendrix. So I laid down this sort of, could we have stopped this, or could this have been done in a different way, or a way that was more responsible to the people that lived there? And then had they listened to John Hendrix, maybe people could have been better organized. And then to end the story, I had a really, really difficult time writing the end to the story, because there's not like the people didn't organize. They didn't listen to John Hendrix. They lost their land, and now a whole different group of people live there. And so there was no vindicating moment for John Hendrix, and there was no vindicating moment where his prophecies were used to stop something from happening. So it was just really difficult to find an ending to the story. And last year I kind of botched it, but this year I think I came up with a good solution, which was just that there's a lot of people in our lives, people on the margins, who are difficult to deal with. John probably had some sort of mental illness. And so there's people in our lives that are they're difficult to deal with. And because they're difficult to deal with, we ignore them and we don't listen to what they say. And if people would listen more to John, or if John had maybe the help that he needed to be a more social person, maybe people would have listened to him more. And so maybe what we can take away from this story is that we need to take better care of people on the fringes of society and pay more attention to what they have to say. So I don't know. I still don't know if it's a good ending. And then there were two quotes that I really liked, because I thought it summed up. Dr. Seuss said, "Crazy isn't enough." And I think that's part of what was going on with John, is that he was probably crazy. And so, but it's not enough to be crazy. If you want people to listen to you, you have to be creative so that they can have a reason to listen to you. And then the author, Dr. Hunter S. Thompson, took that a little further and said, crazy isn't enough unless you can find a way to get paid for it. If you can't do that, then they'll just lock you up. So I think those two quotes are really meaningful to this story, just because if John, again, had a better way of communicating, or was more of a socially accepted person, people probably would have listened to him, and maybe something could have been done. So that's where I am, Ray.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you for giving that recap. And I can't tell you how much that Oak Ridge appreciates what you've done, because you've taken something that we don't really know how to deal with the John Hendrix story effectively. I tell it often to all the tours that come through Oak Ridge, and when I make presentations, I include it in that. I even had the opportunity to learn early on from Ed Westcott. Ed Westcott, as you know, is a man who made all of the black and white images, photographs that we have of Oak Ridge. And during the Manhattan Project, he made 15,250 negatives that are on cold storage in the National Archives. But he is the one that pointed out the grave to the journalist who was writing for the Oak Ridge Journal at the time. And he made the picture of the original tombstone that was on John Hendrix's grave. It's been taken off. Somebody stole it. And then the one that's there now was provided by a class of students at Robertsville. They actually raised the money to buy the tombstone that's there today. And of course, the first reference I found after that article in 1944, the next reference is in George Robinson's book written in 1950, The Oak Ridge Story. And he introduces the book by using the John Hendrix story. So it has become a part of our history. And when I tell it, often or not, someone will say, "Do you believe that?" And Bill, I will never answer them, whether I do or not. I leave that up to the audience to determine whether they want to believe it or whether they don't. And it is something that has become attached to our history in a very unique way. None of the other Manhattan Project sites have anything even to come close to our John Hendrix story in the way of interest and intrigue. And I think that has value from a storytelling standpoint. And you know this and know it well. If you want people to remember something you're telling them, tell them a story. If you put it in a story form, they'll tend to remember it. So tell us a little
Right.
about when you started there. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that it's a really interesting case of how folklore works.
Yeah.
Because if this grave hadn't been found, or for whatever reason, why we know about John Hendrix now, if that hadn't happened, nobody would know about him, or hardly anybody would know about him at all. And so the grave was found. It is this interesting story. Did he really predict it? And then he didn't keep any records. He probably didn't learn to read or write until he was adult or in his teens. So we don't know all that much, like hard fact about him, except the things that you can learn through county records. But we don't know if these prophecies really happen. But as people became more interested in the story of John Hendrix, other people in the community started to remember things that had been said. So a lot of these people had been displaced anyway. They had to move out somewhere else. So there wasn't even the original group of people that had heard these prophecies sitting around the country store, because they'd all been forced to go live somewhere else. So as the story started to emerge, then people started to remember. And I don't want to say whether or not what they remembered is correct, but people would all of a sudden be like, oh yeah, John Hendrix once said.
Yeah.
And so again, we don't have a hard fact. If maybe that person was making that up, maybe they just wanted attention. And so we don't know that some of these prophecies that are attributed to John, maybe somebody else just said, I remember John saying that, or maybe some other person prophesied that and they got assigned to John. Anyway, it's a really nice example of how stories grow, and how maybe what was gossip or hearsay has now gotten to the point where we're wondering if it's fact, or maybe it was slander, and now we want to know, did this really happen? And so it's a really neat and obvious example of how little bits of legend or little bits of things that people do become history. And then it's up to the historian to turn around and sort out what parts of that's true and what parts of it's not.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There are even books written about things that you think you know that did not happen, and they authors have made a good bit of money off of selling books that recreate or attempt to uh, document and prove that some things we think we know, we don't really know for sure. Let's open this up to any of the other folks in the class. If you would like to ask Bill a question, please just unmute yourself and let's have a conversation with him. I think he's laid out the story really well, and he has tied it to how folklore evolves. And I think we've got someone here that has experience in storytelling that we ought to take advantage of. So if you have any questions for him, please come on and ask that question. I appreciate Sue Lasky putting in the chat. She says, if you have never heard Bill tell his stories, you've missed a good time. And I think that's a good way to say it, Bill. I agree with Sue 100%. Okay, who wants to do the first question? Yes, please. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hi, Bill. It's Susan. I was wondering if you had written any like original stories 100%, not based on anything that you experienced. If you've like created a story in one of your, and I heard you this weekend. I thought you were wonderful. We really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you. Ask the question again. Have I written
Oh, I
stories? Is
just
that what
wondered,
you
I know
said?
that your stories are going to be based on real things that happened to you, and then you just use your creativity to create an interesting narrative about it. I just wondered if you had written a completely original story in one of your acts, that's something that's never happened to you or anyone, but you just created a story. I was just curious if storytellers do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, almost all of my stories are 98% made up. Um, I say the names of real people, and they're almost always based on one little tiny fact that I just expand on. But I have a story where we have a kid in our class named Wally, and Wally is named for the country of Wallis and Futuna, which is an island country in the South Pacific. And he is upset because in our school, around the perimeter of the gym, of the ceiling, there are flags hanging from countries from all over the world, and there's not a flag from Wallis and Futuna. And so he is upset about that, and our teacher refuses to acknowledge that Wallis and Futuna is a country, because he's just the kind of guy that would rather ignore something than learn. And so Wally decides to protest and goes into the gym, and we had, the exercise rope when I was still in school. And so Wally climbs up to the roof, and then he gets in the rafters, and he's going to stay up there. And they call the fire department to come and rescue him. He monkey barn back and forth on the rafters, and he ends up living up in the ceiling until Mr. Woodcraft finally acknowledges that Wallis and Futuna is in fact a country. So that's one that, except for the fact I went to school and there was a rope, that's a story that I made up completely out of whole cloth, or whatever, however you say that saying. And then, like, I have a story where my buddy and I dress up like deer, and we tie a mannequin to the hood of our truck, and we drive around town like it's people season, and we got one. And that is based on when I was in high school. My buddy Jay McClung said we ought to dress up like deer and tie a mannequin to the hood of the truck and drive around town. So we didn't do that. We were just smart enough not to do that. But that's a case where I took one little line or one little event that did happen to me, and I sat down and expanded that into a story.
Very good. Thank you. All right, who wants to be next?
I'll be next.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask Bill, which of your stories is best received by the audience?
It kind of depends on the audience. I speak to elementary school students sometimes, and then, I speak to grown adults. And the Wally story, the kid going up in the ceiling, when I'm in a school, that story goes over really, really well, because the teachers, I have one story where teachers are wonderful. It's a different story, but I tell that, and it basically says that all teachers are superheroes. But when I tell the Wally story, it's this kid rebelling against these awful teachers. There's just two awful teachers, but they're there. And so the kids really love that, because here's this kid getting away with, it's like a prison movie where the prisoners somehow dupe the warden, into showing himself as a real idiot. So kids really like that. But then when I tell to adults, the story where we dress up like deer always goes over well. And then I have a story where the attic of the church is infested with bats, and we like to watch the bats fly out of the eaves. And then through a series of events, the preacher tells us that if we don't quit this one behavior, that the demons of hell are going to descend upon us and snatch our souls. And then through a course of events, a hole gets busted in the ceiling of the church, and the bats come out of the ceiling, and we think it's the demons of hell. And that story always goes over well. It's a little more complicated than the way I just laid it out, but that story goes over well. But I think the ones that go over the best are the stories that have the most elements in them that the audience can find something in common. So when I'm talking about things that other people did, or events or places that other people can identify with, it's when stories have something that the audience can grab onto and see themselves in, that's when it goes the best.
Right. Thank you, Sue. Anyone else? Don't let him off the hook now. Now's your opportunity. All right. Well, if there's no other questions for you, Bill, we thank you very much for taking the time out this morning to come and chat with us and give us some insight into storytelling that we just would not have if we didn't have folks like you that knew how to do it and do it well. You are
Well,
a really good one.
Yep.
glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
All right, you bet. And
We'll see you down the road.
yeah, okay, buddy. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
All right. Now let's talk for just a minute. We've got enough time, I believe, that I can include a presentation for you that I made a number of years ago now, but I think it's a good time that we could do that. Now be thinking about what you'd like me to include in stories as we continue on, okay? And now let me give you a presentation about the desegregation of the schools in Oak Ridge. And let me bring you up to speed on what we're doing with the Scarborough 85 Monument Committee and answer any questions you have about that aspect of our history. Is that all right if we move in that direction? Okay. I don't know where that feedback's coming from. Everybody seems to be muted, but not coming from me. Do you hear it as well?
Nope.
Nope. So it's only me. Okay, I'm not gonna worry about it then.
No, I hear it. It's some kind of like almost like a machine or something in the background.
Yeah, and I don't know where it's coming from. Looks to me like everybody's muted. They're gone away now. Okay. My 12-year-old grandson loved your stories of Skeeter and you this weekend. Yeah, Bill does a lot with him and Skeeter. And I don't know if Skeeter's a real person or not. All right, here we go. Let me get this one up now. See if I can tell, make sure which one I need. All right. Desegregation and integration. This brief history of integration in Oak Ridge. And as you'll see, I presented this in 2020 to the high school seniors and a few adults and parents that came into the Oak Ridge High School auditorium. And this is when we were first recognizing the Scarborough 85 and their desegregation of Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High. So I started with the prehistory, as I often do when I'm talking about Oak Ridge, and talk about the native peoples that were here. The Yuchi were last in the area, Cherokee were to the south, and a lay of the land, the streams, and the when the white settlers came in and claimed the land along the river bottom land and along the creeks. And then up to the Civil War period, there were large plantations using slave labor. And then I mentioned the African burial ground, which is out to the west of Oak Ridge. And then a small cemetery near the Galahar family cemetery where the house slaves were buried. And then by 1942, 1,000 farms and 3,000 people living in the communities. But it was fairly well isolated, only a few general merchandise stores. And then there was one small community. There were several communities, really: Robertsville, Wheat, New Bethel, New Hope, Scarborough. And Elza was actually not a community name. It was a railroad siding constructed when the railroad tunnel was being built beneath Black Oak Ridge. And that's the one that Bill Lepp included in his John Hendrix story, that John had said that when they dig that tunnel, they're going to stop a spring, and that actually happened. But that's not something that I routinely include in my story. But it is something you can dig out of the material on John Hendrix. And then there was one small community of African Americans, and it's located near where Cedar Hill Park is today, up on Outer Drive, at the corner of Outer Drive and Michigan, I believe, is where it's located. And it's just one small tombstone in the middle of a yard there. But it was a small community that actually had a church, Woods Chapel. The man buried there is Elijah Wood, and this is pictures of the church that was there. And this is his tombstone. He's a Civil War veteran, and he's located in that cemetery, which is just one tombstone in a little vacant lot there. But there are some field stones and maybe 20 graves there, according to the records. But he was in Company K, United States Colored Heavy Artillery. So that was the African American community that was here in the area before Oak Ridge. Now, the African Americans were a part of the workforce here during the Manhattan Project, but they were not treated the same as white people. They weren't allowed to bring their children, and the husband and wife were not allowed to live together. They put them in hutments, and they actually put a fence around the women's hutments and put a guard on the gate, so that they had to get permission to come in to see one another. And this is what the inside of a hutment looked like. This is a replica that's at the K-25 History Center. And notice there's a stove, and then there would have been beds around the four walls and a stove in the center. Now, Katie Strickland was one of the women that was here with her husband, and she realized that if she could bake some biscuits and give them to the guards, that she might be able to get her husband to stay with her longer. And so she had her husband to bring her a piece of metal out of the construction area, and she used that to put on that stove and bake some biscuits, and she would give those biscuits to the guards so that they would let her husband stay with her longer. Now, we have that pan that she made biscuits on in the K-25 History Center now, right beside that replica of the hutment. It's actually right there. You can see the corner of the display that describes it, but I didn't have a picture of it when I made this presentation. In fact, yeah, that was probably right after the museum had been open. Another example, Jesse Ernest Wilkins entered the University of Chicago at age 13, youngest student ever admitted there. But when he was given the opportunity to come to Oak Ridge, Edward Teller wrote him a letter and told him that he should stay up north, that he should not come down to the south because of the segregated atmosphere that existed down here. And so he never came. Oak Ridge was like the rest of the South, and he said that these Jim Crow laws would make it hard for him to move, and so he didn't. He did not did not come to Oak Ridge because of the kind of information that was written to him to tell him what he would expect if he got here. And things began to change after World War II ended. Gamble Valley was designated as a family housing area for African Americans. Children were allowed and families could live in the houses. Now, they moved them from Gamble Valley, from what's now Woodland over into Gamble Valley. And they also had hired Arizona officer as a principal for a school for Black children, African American, and it was over at Scarborough. That school building is still there today. It was there, built in the 1920s, and it's a part of the Oak Ridge Associated University's South Campus. But they were in that school from 1945 until 1949, and then they moved over into the vacant school in Gamble Valley. I remember when, during the Manhattan Project, that had been an Army officers' housing area and had white families over there, and they had a school. And then when so many people left Oak Ridge that they didn't need that school, they closed it down. So it was sitting there empty, and Arizona officer moved the school from Scarborough over into Gamble Valley. Now, the students wanted to keep the name of the school, so she agreed to that, and they brought it over and named the new school building there the Scarborough School. And then the community adopted that name. And that's how the Scarborough community got the name Scarborough, is because the children brought that over from the original Scarborough School building over on Bethel Valley Road. Then, of course, in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education happened. And then in 1955, the Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High School was desegregated by 85 young Black children from Scarborough community coming into those schools. And it turns out that that was, in fact, the first desegregation of a public school in the Southeast. Now, I define it in the Southeast by defining anything east of the Mississippi River and south as being southeast, because there were a couple of schools in Arkansas that desegregated sooner before Oak Ridge did. Now, Waldo Kahn was chair of the Oak Ridge City Council. He wrote a letter to Congressman Howard Baker, Senator Baker's father, saying there was a tempest in a teapot in Oak Ridge because he had favored integration of the Oak Ridge schools, even before Brown versus the Board of Education. And this tempest in a teapot was a small group, I say small, fairly small group of white people that were resisting the idea of desegregation. He faced a recall vote. It failed. He did, however, resign as chairman of the city council. And then the integration did proceed, but it was not an easy thing to accomplish. People who experienced it personally know the details. Few talk about it even today, even though we've made a lot more publicity about it and promoted the idea of recognizing these people. Some of them are still hesitant to talk about it. Reverend James Spicer tells an Oak Ridge story. He, by the way, he just passed away within the last month. He was living up at Sevierville, and I wrote a story or two, published a story or two about this in the Oak Ridger, and he contacted me and helped me to write a story into the Oak Ridger, and historically speaking, that I really appreciated. Jim Crow was the name given to the laws in force from 1877 to 1960 that were designed to maintain segregation and favored white supremacy. It was a struggle in Oak Ridge even after that 1955 desegregation of 2 schools. Mayor Bob McNeese and Reverend James Spicer decided that if they could get the Davis brothers to desegregate their cafeteria, that would go a long way toward integrating the city of Oak Ridge. If they could get the restaurants to agree, they thought that would be a good way to do it. So they went to Atlanta and they met with the Davis brothers. They were both adamant they were not about to integrate their restaurants, and they escorted the mayor and the preacher out of their office. Now, the airplane ride back, they happened to sit in the same row. The preacher was on one window seat, and the mayor was on the other window seat in the same row. So there were some seats between them that were empty. And a well-dressed young man came in and sat down by the preacher, and the mayor was really hot. I mean, he was just frustrated about how they had been treated by the Davis brothers, and he was just, on a rant talking about it. So the young man sitting there between the two of them said, where are you all from? What are you talking about here? And they told him that they were from Oak Ridge. So a few days later, Gene Joyce, the Oak Ridge lawyer, called James Spicer to his office to tell him that the Davis brothers had agreed to integrate all their restaurants, or to desegregate them. And the young man was actually Guilford Glazier's son. What had happened is he had called, when he told his dad about what he'd heard on the airplane, Guilford called the Davis brothers and told them that they would desegregate their restaurants in Oak Ridge, he would allow them to operate the bowling alley rent-free for the rest of their rental agreement. Now they were renting the cafeteria, and it was doing well, but they were also renting the bowling alley, which was, if you remember, the ARC, A-R-C, bowling alley. And I'll guarantee you, not any of you probably remember what ARC stands for. It stands for Anderson Roane Counties. Just a little tidbit of information there. But at any rate, they were paying $6,000 a year, I believe, for that rental of that bowling alley, which was not really doing well. And so he gave them the rest of that contract for free. And so they agreed to desegregate their restaurants in Oak Ridge. Not only that, they were in the leadership position, at least one of them, of the Restaurant Association across the Southeast. And they influenced desegregation in other restaurants across the South. So the recognition of the 65th anniversary of the 85 young students is what we were doing at this time. It's worthy of all the recognition we can give them. It's been too long in coming. And of course, the Clinton 12 was recognized in 2006, also a long time coming, but that event happened in 1956. And of course, Little Rock, Arkansas, the desegregation that is the most prominent one in civil rights history, happened in 57. So that placed the Scarborough 85 as the first public school in the Southeast to be desegregated. And here's some references that I made to show that we were indeed a public school, although we were funded by federal money at the time, the Atomic Energy Commission. It was defined as a public school. and federal government funds qualified it as a public school. So that's quickly the history of the integration in Oak Ridge, just a fairly high level summary of it. And again, I'd like for us to now stop and have a conversation about anything that you would like. Any questions you have about that presentation or anything about what Bill Lepp brought to us. Let me just open it up to you and let's have a conversation. Go ahead, David.
Yes, I did not live in this part of the country at the time of schools were integrated. I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C.
Huh?
And things went fairly smoothly there. But my enduring memory was going the first day of school. I was in junior high school. And to walk into that building, and I just saw a group of maybe 5 or 6 black students just standing over in the corner looking absolutely frightened. I mean, there were so few of them to integrate to schools. They were just in this new place. They didn't quite know what to do, but they were, my recollection after that, they were well accepted in the school. But I just remember how scared and alone they looked at that time. And I don't know what the experience was of the 85 students here.
Well, let me use one example to tell you about L.C. Gibson, Larry Gibson. He was a freshman in high school when he went over to Oak Ridge High School. And that desegregation happened in September the 6th, 1955, just a couple of months after the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi, Money, Mississippi. Money, Mississippi was L.C. Gibson's hometown before his family came to Oak Ridge. So don't you know that he didn't know what to expect? He's coming out of a school where it was a fairly small number of students, getting individual attention from the teachers. Now their materials, their books and access to resources were not nearly as good as they were going to be in Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High, but they were comfortable and felt safe. Everything was known and they knew what to expect. And now here they are coming into this large group of white people, and not all of the students were kind to them. They did not have any violence associated with it, but there were things said, and you know, I think on one occasion something written up on the wall or a blackboard. I don't remember details, but there were obvious situations that these young students had to face that they would not have faced if they had not done that desegregation. So yes, it was uncomfortable for them. I mean, you got to remember, they were told, don't even look a white person in the eye. I mean, just, and it's hard for us to even comprehend that today, but that was the reality for these young students coming into an entirely different environment, and it turned out good for them in the end. But eventually, as they became accepted, I mean, even in the sports, but when they started trying to include the black students in sports, the surrounding communities wouldn't play them if they brought their black athletes along. So it's hard to even imagine the kind of difficulties. Sue, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just, if you're looking for ideas about what to go into
Yes.
in this class, I would like to find out what it was like for women in the early days of Oak Ridge. How is their life different from our lives now?
Okay.
And I don't know if you've got a lot of research on that.
Well, I do. I have a presentation on women during the Manhattan Project, and I will include that. We will get that presentation included in one of the next two sessions. Okay? Be glad to do that. Any other ideas or thoughts?
Yes, Ray, David Coker again. I'd be interested in, I didn't come here until 1971. I'd be interested in learning a bit more about in what sense did the integration of the schools lead or did not lead to some, shall we say, integration of housing in Oak Ridge? Were Blacks, did they feel free to live in different parts of town? I know I live in a part of town where there are almost no Black families, and that just kind of surprises me in this day and age. But I'd like to learn more about, did integration into the school system lead to what extent did it lead to integration in community life, say, in general, and where people lived and what they did?
Yes, I understand, and I think there's a good bit of a good bit of information I can share with you there, and there may be an individual or two that I can bring on who are African American who can speak from experience. Anything I say has to be from theory or research that I've dug up, but if I can get someone that actually moved into an area and is willing to talk about it, I think it will give more insight. So let me see what I can do, and I will tell you that people looking at Oak Ridge, maybe not people living here so much, but people looking at us will still consider that in some degree we are still segregated, associated with living, and one of the best things we've done is to put the preschool in Scarborough. I think that's a great step, and that's an excellent school, by the way. But if you look, that Scarborough is still essentially segregated from the rest of the city. Many Oak Ridgers have never even been in Scarborough. So, and I don't say that in a negative way nor in a derogatory way. I'm just trying to realize the actual situation that we face. The other thing you have to remember is Oak Ridge is being absorbed into Appalachia. Our demographic is so drastically different than what it was in the early years of the Manhattan Project and even in the Cold War era of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We had a lot of scientists, engineers, and highly educated people that were here living in Oak Ridge, actually influencing the area around Oak Ridge significantly with the hospital and with the school. And then over time, that demographic has changed. What's happening now is there are people moving into Oak Ridge. In many cases, they are service workers. In many cases, they are young families that are just getting started. And if you look, one gauge you can use is free and reduced lunches in the school systems. And if you go back a number of years, 20 years maybe or more, you'll find that there were almost no free and reduced lunches, very low number. And I haven't checked recently, but the last time I did check a couple of years ago, it was up as high as 60, 65% of the students in Oak Ridge school systems are on free and reduced lunches. So that means their family income is low enough that they qualify for free and reduced lunches. So the demographics in Oak Ridge is quite different than it was. Now we're up to 34,000 people and we're growing. I mean, you see these apartment building complexes going up around town, and my understanding is they're fully rented by the time they're completed. So people are moving into Oak Ridge. We have the things going on out to the west, like the small modular nuclear reactor being built at the old K33 site and by Kairos Power. And TVA is building small modular reactors on the Clinch River Breeder reactor site. We've got a new TRISO fuel facility, nuclear facility, going into the Horizon Center. And then, of course, we've got, just recently we learned that the Bull Run steam plant, when it shuts down, there's a fusion energy company going in there. Now, if you think about this, you'll realize that for all of my career in Oak Ridge, 47 years at Y12, fusion energy has been 30 years in the future. It's still 30 years in the future now. So it's not going to be here in my lifetime. And in we're going, those small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, are going to have an impact because they are environmentally the best resource that we have for producing electricity. But eventually we will transition to nuclear, to fusion energy. But I'm saying that to say the future of Oak Ridge is bright and looks good now. But at the same time, we have a changing demographic. And I think we're seeing, as we continue to progress, less and less of the lingering segregation between blacks and whites. Now, we also have a fairly large population of Hispanics in Oak Ridge. So it's not just one minority group that we're looking at. Sue, did you want to say something else? I see your note up in the chat. Unmute yourself.
Actually, I was just going to ask you a question because I'm not from here originally either. Where was Hendrix Farm? I mean, everybody seems to be on it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. John Hendrix is buried at 123 Hendrix Drive in Hendrix Creek subdivision, named for John Hendrix. And he wanted to be buried on top of that hill there so he could look out over his apple orchard, which was down at the bottom of the hill. So if you go into Hendrix Creek subdivision and you just drive right up Hendrix Drive, and you get to 123, there's just a tombstone out in the middle of the yard. And that's all it is now. There used to be a big boxwood tree there, but it got diseased and the owner of the land cut it down. But if you drive on past the tombstone, go down to the next street and turn left, and then immediately turn right into a cul-de-sac, what you will see at the end of that cul-de-sac is a large spring of water in the front yard of a house. I mean, it is just right smack dab in the front yard. And that spring is what starts Hendrix Creek. Now, if you can't see through the woods enough now to see it, but the railroad track is literally not 50 yards from that spring. And between that spring and that railroad track is where his original home place was. And there's a house that's been built there now. It was vacant back when I made the documentary film about John Hendrix, and we actually used that point. And but by the way, if you want to see that documentary film, you just need to go on Google and Google Y12. When you do that, the first thing that's going to come up is the Y12 National Security Complex. When you go there, go to the About, and when you bring that list down, click on History, and then when that list comes up, click on Video Gallery, and there'll be about 12 documentary films that I've put out there. And I'll put that in the chat for you, so if you wanted to click on it, you can get it. But that's where that documentary can be found. And that's where his home place is. Now, as you look, the stream comes from the spring and then runs down right beside the road. And about 200-300 yards down the road is where Parley Raby's place was. And Parley Raby was his stepdaughter. And she's the one that took care of him up until he died. And then as in appreciation for her taking care of him, he deeded her the 15 acres that he had there for a farm. But that's where it's located. Now, give me just a second, and I will bring that link up for you and put it in the chat. And there it is, right there. Copy. Get that down. And type message here. Okay, there's the link to the documentary films. If you want to just reach over there and highlight it and copy it out of the chat, then you can get to any of those documentary films that you like. All right, anything else? We only have about 2 minutes till we have to wrap up. Any other ideas for future sessions or comments or questions about today? Yes, Karen.
I'd like to know something about when Oak Ridge High School office was bombed.
Okay. I remember that. Don't know much about it, but I might find somebody who does. Be interesting if I could find the people right now and see what they think. Probably can't do that. Okay, any other thoughts? Well, I really appreciate you being with me today, and I will put this up on YouTube so that if you ever want to refer back to it, you can. And some of the people who registered are not on here, so they'll be able to get to it and watch it later. I've already been contacted by a couple apologizing, and you know how we are. We're so busy nowadays that we've got things going and we can't always be in 2 places at once. So thank you, and we'll be back again next Monday, and we'll have Dennis Aislinger with us then. Thank you all very much.